E te rangatira manu tēnei mātou e muri aroha nei ki a koe. Kia marire te moe. Kei ngā kanohi ora o te motu tahuti mai ki te hui. Welcome to the Hui, Maori current affairs for all New Zealanders. E taro ake nei. He suffered horrific injuries after being electrocuted at work.
My independence is gone, so I depend on somebody else to care for me, and it becomes very hard to do things for myself as I once did.
Now the whānau of scaffolder Jada Nelson are demanding answers.
My son's life is never going to be the same, ever.
Could his accident have been prevented?
Do you think Super City Scaffolding did everything they could to protect you as a worker that day?
No, there could have been more done.
If there are power lines in proximity to the job, that should have been well identified at the time that the scaffold went up.
It regularly makes news headlines. Maori men, often young, heading off to work one day, only to be critically or seriously injured during the course of their job. Some never make it home. Recently, it was the story of a West Auckland scaffolder who remarkably survived a massive electric shock. Tonight, Jada Nelson speaks from hospital about his horror accident in the hope of improving health and safety conditions for Maori workers, particularly those working in the construction industry. Anei te pūrongo Arawane Pereira.
He was given a 1 in 5 chance of survival.
I call it a blessing to be here still.
A horrific workplace accident left father of 3, Jada Nelson, severely burnt, losing both his arms.
I'm going to be in a wheelchair for a couple of years.
He'll never get to hug his kids again.
No, he won't. Walk his daughter down the aisle, he'd never be able to hold her hand.
Now the whānau of the 28-year-old scaffolder wants to know how a day at work left him fighting for his life.
My son needs closure. We need answers.
I'm just wanting someone to take the responsibility for what's happened.
Jada Nelson began working in construction 10 years ago.
Yeah, working with mates and cousins, it gives you an extra sense of belonging and stuff to work. So working besides them, it made me happy.
You know, it was a job, but it was a job that he did love, you know.
Jaden's mother, Tony Paikia, says even though she knew her son was careful when he was working on sites, she couldn't help but worry.
Just every day, you know, I love you, be safe. And, you know, he'd always text back going, oh, so I'm all right, you know.
You took safety really seriously.
Yeah, I did. It's people's lives that could be taken in an instant.
Tuesday, April 19, 2022.
And there was a real horrific noise. And there was this huge, and I mean huge, big ball of fire.
Neighbour Carol Oliver is still haunted by what she saw that morning. 28-year-old construction worker Jada Nelson had been working at this site in West Auckland for Super City Scaffolding. Dismantling scaffolding, had you done that hundreds of times before?
Yeah, I've done it hundreds of times.
But this time, the steel pole Jada was holding came in contact with these low-hanging, high-voltage power lines as he was taking the scaffolding down.
I knew exactly what had happened because the power lines are so close.
A massive electric shock literally blew Jaden's arms off, damaging his internal organs as high voltage seared through his body. The blast tossed Jaden off the structure he was working on, throwing him unconscious to the ground. You couldn't get over the fence, but you were giving instructions for CPR?
Yes, so I just kept talking, and there was a lot of crying, a lot of screaming. It was just horrific. It shouldn't have happened.
Without Carol's help that day, my son probably wouldn't be here today. When I stand here, those power lines look a hell of a lot closer than you'd picture it in a picture.
WorkSafe is investigating how the accident happened. We'll explain more about the circumstances later. But it's left Tony contemplating what the long-term impacts will be on her son.
It's affected his children, his partner. We're all broken. And our life's just been switched upside down because of this incident.
This is Jarden today, a patient at Auckland's Middlemore Hospital ever since he arrived in an ambulance 5 months ago. And what has it been like being here for 5 months?
Yeah, I've had my ups and downs since being here. I can tell you it's been very hard.
It might be an uphill battle, but it's remarkable Jarden is still alive after extensive internal injuries to his organs and severe burns to around a third of his body. He's now also a double amputee.
My independence is gone, so I depend on somebody else to care for me, and it becomes very hard to do things for myself as I once did.
Do you feel like a burden?
Yeah.
It's not only Jarden who's grappling with his life-changing injuries. Explaining it to his 3 children will take years.
My 2 sons are still young, but my oldest, my daughter, she kind of has a fair idea that Dad is sick. Tried to tell her that Dad's got no hands anymore, because she's so used to me being able to play with her, be able to throw a ball with her.
It's a long road, all right, and it will be a long road until he's old and grey, probably. He's still going to be going through the trauma that he's been through.
What happened to Jarden Nelson and his whānau is horrific, but not unexpected, because if you're Maori, you're more likely to have an accident or be seriously injured while you're doing your job. And it's in the construction industry where many of these accidents occur. Maori workplace deaths are higher than non-Maori as well.
That's what it's about.
Sid Kepa is First Union's Maori Vice President and says he was shocked when he heard about Jarden's accident.
It's terrible. It's, been front page news. If they had a health and safety measure in there, that wouldn't have happened.
Sid says dedicated health and safety representatives who protected workers in hazardous jobs, like in construction, were replaced when the Employment Contracts Act was introduced in 1991. He says these days, self-employed kaimahi have fewer protections from dangerous working conditions.
All they know about is I sign this and I get a job. That's all they know. They don't know anything else. Going back to my day, they gave us everything. Steel toe cap boots, high-vis jackets, all that stuff, because that was part of the agreement we had. But now, you've got to do your own tax, do your own safety, do everything else, and you're only an individual.
Do you think the health and safety of workers, particularly in the construction industry, have become a casualty of cost-cutting?
Yeah, of course. And to me, the government's got to do something about health and safety.
Well, so what they've done with this?
After the break, Jarden Nelson's contract comes under scrutiny when he applies for compensation for his injuries. You had to provide your own
Tools, safety, PPE.
This is a message to all people. No matter the industry, think carefully as to whether you're a contractor or a worker.
And could his accident have been prevented? Do you think Super City Scaffolding did everything they could to protect you as a worker that day?
No. There could have been more done.
If there are power lines in proximity to the job, that should have been well identified at the time that the scaffold went up.
Auraki mai anō. Because they're more likely to work in high-risk occupations, Maori are also more likely to be seriously injured at work. But when it comes to ACC, they face the biggest obstacles to accessing support. Double amputee Jarden Nelson has no recollection of the horrific workplace accident he was involved in earlier this year. The 28-year-old and his whānau are now trying to piece together what happened when he came into contact with high-voltage power lines while on the job. As officials investigate the accident, what are the safety guidelines and what are the financial implications for Jarden and his whānau as he contemplates no longer working in the job he loved? Anei te pūrongo tūrua a Rawani Pereira.
Scaffolder Jarden Nelson is learning to walk again. He's had 40 operations since he was rushed to Middlemore Hospital in April after being electrocuted at work. Had you had any close calls, any accidents before?
Me, no. I've had no close calls. I worked on sites where there has been close calls and dangerous accidents, but I never thought it would happen to me.
His horrific accident raises fresh concerns about the safety of kaimahi working in Aotearoa's construction industry. Jeff Strample is with SiteSafe, an organisation that promotes the reduction of injury and harm on building sites through education.
Overhead power lines are really hard to miss. They're a well-known risk. Missing that is pretty impossible.
Jeff says the industry standard is that all risks should be clearly communicated to workers. In Jarden's case, the low-hanging power lines being so close to tall metal poles.
For a dismantle, if there are power lines in proximity to the job, that should have been well identified at the time that the scaffold went up.
Jarden can't remember anything about his accident, but a colleague alleges that no safety briefing took place that day. They also say that Jarden and his team didn't put up the scaffolding. The job they were doing, taking it down, was the first time they'd ever been at the site.
Quite often it won't be the same crew that comes back to do it as well, but even if it is the same crew, we start the day, what are we doing? What are the major risks? How are we controlling them?
There is also a minimum safety distance if scaffolding structures are in close proximity to power sources.
So if you're working within 4 metres of any power lines, there's a requirement to get in contact with the line owner and then arrange for consent to work there, and the line owners will generally then say, well, this is what needs to happen.
When you're working with power lines so low like that, would you sleeve them off or would you put a marking on them or red flag them?
Yeah, they would be sleeving around the power lines. As if there was no sleevings, either the power lines would be turned off.
Normally that would be the case, but the lines that electrocuted Jarden were of such a high voltage, they service the entire Waitakere West Auckland region. That makes switching off the lines or protecting them by sleeving them impossible. Super City Scaffolding's sole director, Claire Attard, declined our requests for an interview, saying it wasn't appropriate to comment while the accident was still under investigation. Before Super City Scaffolding, Attard was a CEO for a chain of fitness centres. She hasn't responded to our queries regarding her scaffolding company's safety protocols. But on their website, Super Cities say they take a hands-on approach to health and safety, and returning their staff safely to their families each night is their #1 priority. What contact have you had from Super City Scaffolding?
Only texts with them sending me his payslips. No formal letter saying sorry. Nothing.
So the director, Claire Attard, has never visited or contacted you?
No, I haven't heard from Claire. Nothing from Super City Scaffolding.
That's right, nothing from Super City Scaffolding after his near-fatal accident. WorkSafe say it will take about a year to investigate and determine if anyone will be held responsible for what happened to Jarden. In the meantime, his whānau wait, desperate for answers.
As a parent, yes, I want answers. Someone needs to be held responsible. My son's life is never going to be the same, ever.
Can you accept that this was an accident?
Yes, it's an accident, but it's an accident that could have been stopped.
Jardin also lost his livelihood when he lost his limbs.
And how difficult have things been financially for you guys?
Financially, it's been hard. It's been a struggle, especially me being in here and not being able to provide.
And then looking at his pay.
Jardin was on $27 an hour for doing potentially dangerous work, just a bit more than the minimum wage. He even had to supply his own personal protection equipment on that money. He was the main income earner in his whānau, but as a double amputee, he won't be able to work again for years. Like many in his situation, Jardin had no idea what his entitlements were for compensation.
A lot of people do not know about how to access ACC, particularly young Maori. I have found in the work that I do, whether you're a forestry worker or a construction worker, there's not an awareness of how ACC works.
Hazel Armstrong specialises in ACC law and is Jardin's legal counsel.
Well, I think there's a structural bias against Māori. When they get injured, they're less likely to claim and they get less entitlement. So at each step of the way, there's disadvantage. Some of my clients are rural, uncertain internet, only have a phone, no computer, no printer. They may not have an accessible GP. All of those are structural disadvantages.
Yeah, I wouldn't have got anything if it wasn't for the lawyer that I have. Couldn't thank you enough for getting what I deserved.
While Jardin feels let down by his employer, he has been overwhelmed by the kindness of strangers, with more than $75,000 donated by the public to his Give a Little fund.
I can't be grateful enough, especially for the ones that are still here and continue to follow me on my journey. You know, it means the world to me.
But there's more big bills to come. In time, he'll have to choose prosthetic limbs, and the hunt is on for a wheelchair-friendly new home. But Middlemore Hospital will be where he'll stay for a while longer.
I have a lot of pain still, even though all my operations and stuff are done, all the main wounds are all closed, I still have pain. And I'll probably live with that pain for a couple of years.
His whānau have been by his side through his brave battle. Their aroha instrumental in his miraculous recovery.
The main thing here is that I'm still here, still living life. Be here for my kids and family. Especially my partner that's been here and stood by my side through everything.
Well, WorkSafe haven't responded to our requests on where they're at with his investigation. The Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, Michael Wood, says work is progressing on regulations which aim to provide better health and safety for workers, including clearer and stronger rules for workers at heights and ensuring that offences for breaching the rules are proportionate to the risk of harm. If you'd like to donate to Jardin Nelson's Give a Little page, the details will be on our Facebook page. Ka hui anō tātou ākonei. Cabinet has agreed to a plan setting out the priorities for the Māori media sector over the next 3 years. It includes funding, workforce development, te reo Māori and Māori perspective programming. Hei matapaki I tēnei take ko hono mai Stacey Morrison I ka whiro o te umanga pāpaho Māori, rawa ko te hiamana o te uepu aro take ko Jason Aki. Tēnā kōrua.
Tēnā kōrua.
So Jace, you led the panel. Do you think the collective thoughts, whakaaro, are represented here?
I think what we managed to do was to cobble together the feedback that we received from the sector the best way that we possibly could have. You know as well as a number of us that the sector has been under siege for many years, and sitting behind that was a need to resource and fund it to a level that it required in order to get to that next space. So in essence, I think we've managed to navigate through that space quite well. There is still more work to be done though.
Let's come to you, Stace, because at the heart of all of this is te reo Māori. When you look in, when you read that report, do you think that we are kei te manaaki tonu mai tātou I te reo?
Me mana ki tātou I tō tātou reo Māori kia tika. So there is some really good kōrero about te reo Māori and how we make sure that this is part of our content consumption, but then there's still this slight thing that I think we'd like to have a wānanga further on around how do we measure the impact of te reo programming on acquisition, and should it sit so heavily in terms of acquisition. Kia au nei, ka rea no tātou kia tino whai I tētahi mea hei ine. So I don't know about measurement yet. We talk about kopa in here still, going from kore to passive to active, but within that, within our access to te reo Māori programming, let's look at what is most effective, and is it something like Squid Games in te reo Māori but coming from a Māori perspective? Interesting
that kōrero, Jace. I wondered if you had a perspective on that. Stacey talking about the acquisition and the reliance on producers to come up with real reports and the rest of it. Perhaps it should be, you know, Ministry of Cultural Heritage or Te Taurewhiri or Te Puni Kōkiri that's actually looking at the measurement of te reo to let everyone just get on with making programs.
Yep, I can't agree with that. And the reason why I can't agree with it is I think some of those measurement tools ought to be populated by iwi thinking. Otherwise, it gets mixed up in an overly bureaucratic system that resides in Wellington. And you know, and we all know that while we've got organisations down there like Te Mātāwai, also like Te Taurewhiri I Te Reo Māori, both organisations essentially crown organisations because that's where they're funded from. We need to populate that thinking, and I know that's quite a controversial thing to say, and a number of the board members will disagree vehemently with me about that. But I think the absence of an iwi voice is a recipe for disaster if it's not included in that space.
Yeah, the report talks about the fragmentation of Māori language organisations, and here we're talking about an iwi voice. How might that look? You know, how could we bring that in?
Yeah, I don't actually think we're disagreeing. I think that we've just got to get the right model of how it works. Who has to put the mahi in, and where does the money come from, to make sure that programs get made by the people who are best at making programs and the people who can tell us what impact it's having and what we need to do in terms of the deal, which of course is iwi as well, that they're always involved and can offer the things that they know best.
Jace, I want to talk to you a bit, because in here Whakaata Māori, who's always received direct funding in terms of the operations, it looks like they're going to receive direct funding in terms of the content as well. The ngā reo irirangi, not so much. Are you disappointed with that?
Let me talk about a couple of things there. So absolutely, they're going to be, Whakaata Māori will be funded to provide some content. We were adamant as a board or as a panel that in terms of the entire content that makes up their programming, that at least 70 to 80% of it needed to be procured from members of Te Ngā Aho Whakaari, for example, or by external producers from outside. So that was the expectation that underpins quite a bit of that advice. And it's our sort of wish, or it's our view, that that ought to be listened to very
so Jace is talking
very carefully.
Yeah,
and what was the second question?
So just coming back to Stace here, so about 80%, well, you know, what the panel's saying is that about 80% of the content should be made from, you know, Māori outside of Whakaata Māori. In terms of Ngā Reo Irirangi, who have always struggled for, funding, there is no suggestion they're going to get any direct funding for content. Are you disappointed with that?
A couple of things on the radio front. What we managed to do is there are two things that they raised with us. Actually, there were more, but two main things. One of them was that they required funding to be given to them over a number of years rather than the annual appropriation, which they were forced to go back to Māngai Pāho for. So what we've said is that longitudinal contracts need to be invested inside the system so that they've got more surety around staffing, around all of those types of internal costs, operational costs. So that was significant. The other one is the removal of the transmission costs to radio stations. Mihi, some of those radio stations pay up to 20 to 25% of their annual budget toward transmission costs. Those costs will no longer fall on iwi stations. It'll be the government's responsibility to find funding for them via Korea and others. So that represents roughly, to some of them, a 20% increase in annual baseline funding.
Tēnā pai. And also in there it talks about how, all of the industries are reforming at once. You've got the public media entity also doing the same. So this is an opportunity for us to have a world-class alignment strategy, if you like, for media. What would that look like? Is it bringing whakaata Māori into the tent and those kinds of things?
I think so, and that's what we're asking for. And so the timing of this report is interesting because it wasn't when it was originally expected, but in the end it's quite good because being first in to this public media kōrero means that we set the pou with Māori media and then welcome everyone in. So it's about what are the best resources to share, where do we keep mana motuhake, and where are we just really efficient in our thinking.
What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I agree, absolutely. There are other opportunities that rest inside the sector as a whole that we do need to be visible on and take advantage of. Our expectation as a panel is that the public media organisation, when they sit down to decide what that might look like, that it is underpinned by a very strong treaty framework. And so that our voice isn't just an add-on voice to it, but it's also intimately involved in not just the strategic direction, but how it'll roll that out. And I think there are opportunities there.
Yeah, so that means leadership, of Māori leadership in the public media space. So not just sort of, we're public media and so that's good for everybody. We know that doesn't work. We need Māori in leadership in those roles as well as Māori who are powerful and well-resourced in Māori media.
Tēnā kōrua,
let me be a bit controversial here. So why don't we think about a co-governance model where we have a Māori chairperson as well as non-Māori chairperson of that public media entity?
Tēnā kōrua, e mihi ana kia kōrua. Ko hikina te hui e hoa ma, no horo mai rā. Nā te puna whakatongarewa te hui I tautoko.